Okay, everybody, we are going to start our discussion and Q&A part of the evening. So you've all had a chance to interpret the performance personally, but now we're going to hear a bit about the thinking behind the performance. But before we do that, could I invite each of the panellists to introduce themselves?
Yes, so I'm Christiana from the Doing Group, but I am also currently working with scientists on a Master's in Ecology and Contemporary Performance in Helsinki.
I'm Colin McInnes. I'm Deputy Head of the School of Engineering here at the University of Glasgow.
Hi, I'm Maira and I'm a PhD researcher in nanoscale electronic engineering.
And I'm Julien. I'm a lecturer in biomedical engineering at the University of Glasgow.
Thanks, everyone. So maybe we could hand over to Christiana first of all to give a bit of background on what we saw tonight.
Sure. Where to begin? So, Unphysical Things was what we called the piece. And as Zara had told at the beginning, it started with a very kind of casual interaction with a group of engineers that the Science Festival brought us together with. And it took quite a few swings around different themes and topics before it became whatever that was. Initially, we did try doing some very high school, sometimes primary school engineering tasks to see if we could get ourselves up to speed with some of the tasks that these guys do. We smashed a lot of eggs, made quite a lot of mess. We toppled quite a few spaghetti towers. And then we thought maybe this isn't what we should be doing. Maybe we should just accept that we are not engineers, and started to look more into the overlaps between your process and ours. And so we asked a lot of questions to a lot of engineers and asked a lot of questions of ourselves. Okay, how do we begin a process? What is a process? Like, what are we aiming for whenever we make work? Why did we become artists? We asked, why did you become an engineer? And we found a lot of similarity in those answers. So that kind of human element came through for us. A lot about this idea of building a future, which we found to be a little bit more accessible than geometry or structural engineering. So we went with that. And as we said in the introductory text, we looked back what's been done before, and one of the big projects that we found, which was a major inspiration for us, was called the 9 Evenings, and it took place in the 60s in New York, and that was the footage that you saw on the small handheld camcorder. And what that was a very, very similar setup where prominent artists from that time, including John Cage, Deborah Hay, were working with engineers working in the most advanced technology of the time, and they were asked to make work in response to that collaboration. But what we saw in that was a very different relationship with technology to what we have. So the first section of the piece, we kind of looked for the feelings that they had, or the feelings that we felt from looking at their stock footage. So this feeling of like expectation. We felt like there was a lot of hope. Things were quite physical, like building these spaces. So, there was a lot of very spatialized things that people walked in and out, which reminded us a lot of World Expos, when people would go to the Crystal Palace or go to Buckminster Fuller's Dome. But we felt that in our contemporary relationship to technology, we don't have this kind of spatialized sense that maybe they were acting off of. So we thought, where do we go from there? And that's where the piece became Unphysical Things. So we tried to think, okay, what are the infrastructures that we engage with every day, which felt much more intangible, much more cloud-like, much more data-based. And we do know from conversations with multiple engineers that that is not the only type of engineering that goes on. Of course not. Like, there's the new bridge in Fife, like, other things. So we don't want to say that that is the only thing happening, but in our contemporary understanding, or our contemporary experience of technology and development and future, this was this thing that kept coming back to us, this kind of what's in the spaces in between. It's not so much in these built structures anymore, but what's here and here. And so that's what we played with a lot. And just constantly in mind this question of how do you build a future? Why do you build a future? Who's building the future? Who's got access to this future? Kind of turning over. Obviously.
So taking that idea of physicality and just turning to the engineers, how physical is the work that you do? Are you building and making tangible things, or is it more this idea of the virtual world? Starting with Colin.
I don't build anything. I'm a physics graduate turned engineer, so I've both not been engineering for the past 25 years. I used to break things in the physics lab, and so I've never built anything in terms of research. I'm still an engineer because what I do is imagine things and using mathematics rather than using laboratory experiments. So much of my research has been on mathematical modelling of satellite orbits. So that's using an understanding of physics in order to create ideas for example, exploring the solar system. And I think it's that, if you can pick up the creative aspect of engineering, that's what distinguishes it from the physical sciences. And it took me a long time actually from going from being a kind of physics graduate to engineer to really understand that. And there's the 20th century aerodynamicist Theodor von Karman. He says that the natural sciences understand the world as it is, but engineers create the world that has never been. And it's a very important distinction because the sciences, they're interrogating the world we live in, trying to understand it, but engineering, what they are, is creating something entirely new. And that's why I also think it's hugely important in terms of communication and public outreach that science communication can work very well as a one-way flow of information. So the kind of Brian Cox model of isn't the Higgs boson so exciting and awesome? Engineering is quite different because engineering is creating something which has never been like the arts, and that's much more of a two-way dialogue, and it's co-creating the future which we want to live in.
Maira, how physical is your engineering?
What I do is a lot physical to me because I physically make these tiny chips that I can bet every single one of you have a phone that has at least one transistor in, because I make transistors. You physically have them with you, but you don't see them, so they're kind of invisible to you, even though you're carrying them wherever you go, I assume. But to me, they're very physical till every atom layer that it's in there.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. My job actually is almost in between the two because so I do biomedical, and I do tinker a lot with physical things as devices, microscopes, etc. But the things I look into, I can't see. I mean, it's molecules, DNA, proteins, and so it sits in between because I have to imagine, okay, if that molecule does this, then my system will behave this way. And then I look at something that's way beyond in terms of what happens. And so I do both the physical and the imaginative bit with just thinking about something, and usually it doesn't work. And then finding out what needs to be done on the process.
Are there any comments or questions from the audience at this stage? Yeah?
So I guess as a mathematician, I would like to challenge some of the assumptions about science existing as it is, because the mathematician is also a creator of things. So of course this is a philosophical question, what pre-exists and what is created. But that creative urge, I think, is common to everything I've seen, both in this dramatic world, the engineering world, and the scientific world. I think the thing that I'm particularly interested in is exactly this in-between place, imagines what they want has to recognise they are not gods of the universe and that there are in fact limitations. So in fact, an interesting sort of tension exists between what you wish and what is actually possible. So you may seek to create the new, but there are in fact boundaries to what can be created.
Yeah, if I just pick this more in terms of motivations, I think the rules by which we are bound, and it was seen in the piece, it's what comes before and where we want to get to. And I think these 2 points for engineers are fundamental. Where we come from is, we build knowledge, we read papers, we go and talk to people. But where we go to is not something that we imagine for just the pleasure of imagining it and thinking about building something completely new and fantastic, but it's something that will solve a problem. So we always start with saying, well, how can I solve this issue? And then using the boundaries that you've very well described, how can I fit within these boundaries to actually solve that problem?
Yeah, I think what you described, I think it's a very, very nice description of engineering. It's using your understanding of physics and the tools of mathematics to put together the pieces in new and interesting ways. But they are, you're absolutely right, of course, the envelope of possibilities is constrained by the laws of physics.
This envelope of possibilities, you used the phrase last time in our last discussion, and it was also a big... That's actually what
envelope.
that was. No, but we really like that expression because we quite often come back in our creative process to the idea of possible futures, and this envelope was a very nice overlap for us between our practices. Yeah.
So in your first piece, I noticed each of you were playing or tinkering in some way. So I wanted to ask the engineers, how much do you play or tinker around in your own work? Was that inspired by discussions with the engineers and how they worked?
Yeah, partially.
I guess I do that like all the time. I just try to do what's called an educated guess, which way to go, because there are like many things you can do. Like you just have to pick one, and then you just try, and you fail, and you try again and again, and hopefully one time it will work and it will make things better.
There's a view that I mean, it's Newton's laws, right? You can dictate wherever the planets will be at whatever time, but actually that never works. And so when we think about doing something, as you say, it's given the direction, right? We know the laws will say this should work there, but the parameters are too many. You can't really actually control everything, and so you just have to try and then learn about these parameters. And sometimes you understand them better when you try, and so then you know a new law that helps you go a bit faster. But sometimes there's no way. It's too complicated, and what you do is you just frame the space, an envelope, right? You build the envelope, and then you know if I'm in there, this will happen. But if I move away from that, then this will not happen, and so I need to stay in there. And that's how you tinker. You tinker by just pushing a little bit and feeling your way out.
This is just a comment, but it was kind of going back to the stereotypes, and it's very nice to see engineers sitting in front of everybody in the spotlight.
We're everywhere.
That stereotypical view of engineers being totally introverted. But one of the comments at the beginning was the discuss, collaboration. But what we saw was 4 totally individual people that didn't come together or meet or anything. And I just thought,
Not to criticize.
Is this representative of how engineers work? You know, that sort of joke that how do you know somebody's an engineer? Because they're looking at, what is it?
An extroverted engineer, yeah.
The extrovert engineer is looking at the other person's shoes and not their own.
I would say that's more or less in the true direction. We do discuss and then we go and do our own little project. And then after a while we go and discuss again. We don't really do everything together. I think that is kind of a social trend between the engineers. But we still need those other people. You can't do anything on your own. You need help.
You have to have the collaboration.
Because you look from a problem from one side, the other person will see something else you never saw, and that's how you go forward.
And as the joke, how many engineers you need to change a light bulb, and I forget how many, but it's a lot. and it's true. I mean, the systems are so complicated now that even with data and analysis and etc., you have to be specialized in one particular area, and then you need other people to build around this and fit and slot into it in a way that works. And often now it's at the boundaries between disciplines. I mean, you have mathematicians that will slot in, engineers that will slot in, biology that will slot in, quantum mechanics that will slot in. I mean, there's lots of things that need to come together to do something. So the discussion is always there, but when you want to do something and really think hard about it, usually, yes, we do it on our own.
Sorry, I'm totally hypersensitive, and there's about 4 or 5 issues, but was anybody else in the room? I was taking terrible panic attacks, and with the smoke and the thing, and I thought, is it just because I was worried about the smoke and feeling I was choking and everything, and then somebody said to me it was just the ice or something that you had used, but I was still getting other smells through it. I'm only asking if anybody else was affected with that.
I certainly felt, I mean, I thought it was an amazing effect of your performance. I felt, I don't know about anyone else, quite anxious during that second performance because you had it was quite stressful, wasn't it? There was that kind of, I think that the first performance, there was definitely a hope there and an excitement, and we were waiting for it to inflate, but the second time it was a different kind of anticipation, a kind of dread. So it's a good comment. Was that a deliberate effect that?
Yeah, I think it came off a little bit of like how we felt people engage with futures now, and it's become almost cliched, this thing that it's easier, it's very easy to see the future nowadays as this very dystopic, very scary thing, which I don't think, if we're using the time frame that we were examining before of the 60s, rocket launches, I don't think that was the same anticipation in the same sense, although having not been there, maybe that's too much of a simplification. But yeah, so we were trying to kind of engage with that feeling, where I think a lot of the technology which we felt excited us was actually stuff which was things like trying solar energy panels, things which were more preventative. So it felt like this idea of like constant progress for us felt quite intimidating. Artificial intelligence, different data storage. We felt very overwhelmed by all of that. So yeah, I suppose that was a feeling that we tried to emulate.
So do you think that attitudes towards technology and engineering have changed since the 60s then?
Colin? Hey. That's where you were heading, wasn't it?
Personally, I can't remember the 60s. I can remember a little bit of the 70s and most of the 80s. Yeah, I guess there's the change between, I guess, the kind of post-war kind of techno-optimism of the kind of 50s and 60s. I mean, that's pretty clear cut. I think as a society we're more sophisticated in our choices and in how we frame our debates and discussions, and so what it goes back to this idea of kind of co-creating the future, that the 50s and 60s, it was, isn't technology amazing? It can fly to the moon, and it's this kind of unquestioning nature of how we accept technologies. I think to me it's important is there's the envelope of possibilities, which this big inflatable cube, but within that envelope of possibilities, there's futures which are more desirable than others, and that's part of the co-creation process is to understand those futures which we all have something in common and we can believe in to create. So I think there's simply a change. I think just now our contemporary debates about the future are quite often fairly dystopian. I get pessimistic about our pessimism. I think engineers by our nature are actually optimists about the future. And certainly for me, if I was to be pessimistic about anything, it's about our pessimism as a society about the future.
And absolutely, we didn't want to make ourselves out to be these like total technophobes or put any judgment on saying that any kind of process or technological development is bad. Like, obviously there's incredible things happening in medicine and in every field, but it was more just a fear of the power structures, of the access, the tangibility. We're not telling people to go and live in the woods.
How optimistic are you as engineers? So Colin's definitely an optimist. How about you guys, Maira and Julien?
I would agree that every engineer is an optimist, because once we have an idea, we believe we're like fully in. We're totally going for it, no matter what. We're gonna try until it works. And I think that's a common trend among all the engineers, that we have I must keep going. I can do this.
Yes, and I think it goes back to the motivations. I mean, the reason why we go to work or try to imagine things is because we have a problem to solve and we have something to do to make things a bit better. And what better is depends on different people, and for sure some people will misuse the word in some ways. But to go back to Colin's point, I think also the difference now is that the access to these developments are much wider, and so the discussion outside of engineering is not such a dark science that you don't understand what's happening. It's you're better at your phones than I am, for sure. and so this access to technology then builds a dialogue that is more prevalent than I think it was before. And that means as well that then people can realize, well, okay, if this goes wrong, then something can happen, which maybe before was a bit less tangible and easy to do.
I'd like to bring some of your research in. So I'm wondering, where do you see your field going in the future? What's next for your research? Or can you make that prediction about where it might be headed? Colin.
Okay, I'll start. Okay. I work in space engineering. So we work on understanding satellite orbit, spacecraft trajectories, understanding what the possibilities are for space. What's particularly exciting about the space sector just now, and particularly here in the UK actually, it's not so much the kind of NASA, you're exploring the Saturn, kind of the solar system. It's using satellites to face inwards, pointing down at Earth. And so we see a whole range of satellite applications. So for telecommunications, remote sensing, satellite navigation, and as we've talked about before, I mean, one of the successes actually of space engineering is that much of it is invisible in our everyday lives. So if you, like most people, if you've got your smartphone and you use Google Maps to find your way to the subway station or whatever, the little blue dot in Google Maps, your smartphone is listening to 4 GPS satellites 20,000 kilometres above the Earth, each of which has been designed by thousands of engineers, has an atomic clock on board, and has been launched in a huge rocket just so you get the little blue dot in Google Maps. And that's the space industry. And that's the tangible kind of application of it. And part of its success is not the Apollo moon landings or Cassini in orbit around Saturn. It's these kind of everyday uses which we have for space engineering, whether it's satellite navigation, telecommunications, being able to get live news reports from across the world, or for remote sensing, for environmental monitoring of the Earth, which is a huge application for space technology. So again, it's a techno-optimist. My view of space is that what's really important actually is not so much the outward-looking aspect of space engineering, but it's the inward-looking aspect of it in terms of understanding the Earth's environment, connecting people, and providing a whole range of satellite services.
Sorry, I'm way back. I unfortunately remember the 60s and 70s. And what I don't know if you've heard of them, the scanner and the quantum machines. The Russians developed the scanner machines after the Cold War ended, and the Americans built the quantum out of the space technology. But they didn't go, everything changed and everybody had their own agendas. But I was hoping they would be the basics. And my fear is that everybody's going on, as that man was coming at, was a point I would love to make. You're not looking at, you're doing all these experiments, which we see just now with them letting off the bombs that's causing the tsunamis and everything, and we don't know what we're doing to our own genome, and why is all the cancers and everything, how is all the technology affecting the human genome, or whatever, and that's you're saying about all the technology with the sorry, what was your terminology? The many things in
Transistors.
the many transmitters, how it's affecting people's physiology.
Well, they're definitely influencing you because they are radiating microwaves, which are just waves at really fast frequencies. They do affect you. Well, the aim of the technology is to build around them a shield that would protect you. It's not been 100% efficient so far, but people still try to build things that would make it safe for you, and they haven't, like, there have been not enough researches to show like what exactly, like, we don't know what it does to you yet, so then it makes it harder to make a protection for a human being.
I think, I mean, this is a very interesting point because it goes back to why we're doing what we're doing, and there will always be bumps and lows. I mean, what I do as you know, the technologies I developed are specifically for medical diagnostics. So, you know, we discover that cancer happens or that Alzheimer's happens, and biologists don't understand it, and I mean, no one understands it. And so what do we do as engineers? Well, we build MRI machines and try and image the system so that biologists can then make the hypotheses and test them and find out what happens. And then when they find out what happens, then we can deliver drugs to that. And so we develop the systems to deliver the drugs, or to actually do radiotherapy or etc. And so that's how, I mean, I sort of work or get motivated by my work, is that I see something that is an issue, a problem, and that I could sort of approach on the side with developing new technologies, and that's what I do in the morning when I wake up.
I think there was a question here.
Yes, well, I wanted to also ask the question from, in terms of what the show did, it's like there's the positive side from the 60s, this optimism, and then maybe a different sort of side in the future and how we're seeing it now. So then I want to ask the question, do you, like from scientists, do you, well, from my point of view, is these new technologies and science, is there a risk that they are making, there's the haves and the have-nots, because a lot of people, they're making a lot of people's brains redundant. So if we're having all this, you know, it's fingertip, we can get all these facts from everywhere. What does that mean for some people who maybe aren't learning all this stuff or doing that? Is there a risk of making a lot of people dumbing and loads of people down?
That is a fantastic question.
But like, I would say there definitely is a risk, and a good example is Google Maps. People nowadays, they don't know how to get anywhere without the blue dot. They don't know which, like, they don't know that I need to turn left at the third cross. They just don't pay attention to that anymore because they just need to follow that little arrow that says, you need to turn now, you turn. You just, it's kind of, it tells you what to do and you don't think,
So
you
how
just
is that
do.
good, and how is technology going to address that?
Now, this is interesting because this is our job. So, you know, I'm a lecturer, Colin's a professor. We do educate. I mean, this is actually more than 50% of our time. And the point that I want to make is that these technologies do enable people to do things without thinking too much about them, but they also enable people to think a lot more about other things. And so there's a lot of developments now about having teaching done on mobile platforms. So you could be in the bus, but you don't even need Google Maps, and actually start learning about space and transistors and how they work. And these technologies make learning a lot easier than it was before. I mean, we had the piece at the beginning with the person on the floor with papers. We seldom do that now. We do that a little bit, but not too much. And the reason is that we've got tools that enable us to go a bit faster. And that is something that I think we want to try to fan out as far as we can and include as many people as we can.
But do you think, in a sense, that speed in turn kind of commodifies education and removes it? If your education is being delivered in this like hyper-technological way, then where is the space for the tinkering and the experimentation and the play and the exchange of ideas? Who does that target? What kind of workers is it bringing in, and what are their aims? Is it a bit more conveyor belt? Like, it's just a question.
No, it's a very difficult question. So, I mean, this is always evolving, right? And the idea of having lectures delivered online is something that has just happened. I mean, it's something that we are dealing with as a university. And the way we're dealing with that is that we are just opening a space in the university that will be accessible first to our students, and then there'll be a different space further in the new campus that will be accessible to everyone, and that is a space to do tinkering. And so there'll be 3D printers, there'll be solder irons, maybe, and papers and boards to write on. And the idea is that you can't actually decompose this. You can't have only the ether and not the tinkering things. And so the university is responding by providing both in an advanced fashion.
Yeah. I mean, we've got an initiative which just started off this semester called the Creativity Lab for new first-year engineers, where we're running non-credit-bearing, non-examinable sessions on a Wednesday afternoon, where we're getting groups of new first-year students to tinker with a blank sheet of paper, given a challenge, and got 3 hours to solve the challenge. The one we did on Wednesday this week was using Lego. We're going to be using Connects. We're going to be using also, it's a very, very easily accessible kind of mechanisms, but it's really to get students, first year students in particular, to realise that engineering is not just applied physics and mathematics. It's about creativity. It's about, in the same way that the arts are, it's about new ideas. And the link between engineering and the arts, which you mentioned, we had a workshop about a year ago, and the little feedback cards, and somebody had written, it's beautiful, they'd written that artists and engineers have common dreams. And that's very true, because it's an inherently creative process. But very, very briefly, to the person that asked the question back there, the impact of engineering on inequality, that's a huge issue for the future, particularly with robotics and automation. It has the potential to free us from things we would rather not do, to give us time to do other things we would rather do. In the same way that machines have done for back to James Watt, but the key challenge is how we share the benefits of that, and that's a wider societal question. It's not just a question for engineers, and it comes back to the whole idea of co-creating the future, which we all want to inherit.
The first part of what you said was exactly what I've just been thinking. I don't know how deep the collaborative process was, but was there a point when the engineers looked at the creative side and said, God, I'm jealous you get to play? And was there a point when the creative side said, I'm jealous of your money?
So I can answer the first one, and the question is no, because I play every day.
What I mean was, you get to play, but are you allowed to actually say, I play? Because you have said several times you look for an answer to a problem. You didn't say, I just play.
Well, yes, so there are different ways of looking at this, but one way that I quite like to do personally, and I know that other engineers don't do this, but in our lab we call them Friday afternoon experiments, and these are experiments where we do them just because we want to do them, and we don't do them because we are going to save the world. We do them because it's going to be fun. And to be honest, the best piece of engineering that has come out of what we do has come out of one of these Friday afternoon experiments.
And I would say from our perspective, it's maybe a romanticized view that as an artist you entirely have this playfulness. I think a lot of the commercial restraints that we discussed with engineers also apply to the arts. Like, so although this project maybe looked fun in some ways,
Sorry, can I just say it was a loaded question?
Yeah. Okay. So, in the same way, I think the arts industry is functioning in this product orientated. Give us a brief. What will it do? Now make it happen. Like, we could have continued to just play with inflatables with no narrative. You know, we could have quite easily done that for the whole summer. But there was still this end point, in the same way that if someone is constructing a drill or a piece of technology where you're like, okay, now deliver the product. I think in a lot of ways there's a huge commercial overlap in those things.
We are a not-for-profit organisation.
I wonder, with your blown-up envelope which you had, were you thinking in terms of looking at something alien, or in the future you were separating out the present and the future? So was that, and what was the fumes or whatever you were using? Vapors, I would say. And the person who went in, I was a bit worried about it.
Staff? Are you okay?
Yeah.
Just about.
Was it tested out before?
Yeah, yes, it was all approved. And the first question was asking about the cube. Was this representing some kind of future, some kind of futuristic image? In some respects, yes. We also definitely function as a performance company in that we're quite action-based, so we quite like to make something happen and kind of see what that does to an audience. So we don't always have such strict ideas in mind of what you need to get out of it, but rather make suggestions or make an atmosphere and see what happens. But part of that atmosphere was definitely trying to create this futuristic space, but in some ways taking inspiration from quite retro aesthetics of what the future would look like. So the plastic is quite a futuristic material from a certain perspective, and so we were kind of playing with those ideas a little bit. We had footage on the video which showed from the 50s, 60s, the first plastic house made by Monsanto, where they were kind of hailing plastic disposables as this incredible turn in humanity, and like, look what we can do now that we can throw this away. So there was a kind of double edge to it, a sort of, a play on this idea of expectations of future, but also on redundancy, on progress, on how these things change. That's what's in our heads, but it's interesting to hear that came up for you as well in the view of it.
Ecology side of things, can you say something about that?
Ecology. So I'm doing a pilot master's in Finland, which is radical in a sense, where it's trying to create connections like this project between different areas of the sciences with artists. So we have been in different contexts working in biological research stations in Lapland, or in wet labs, working with tissue, also with climate scientists, with people from lots of different contexts. And the overarching question is kind of, what can this communication contribute to climate crisis, those dialogues? Is arts just about educating people, taking facts from the sciences, or is there some other thing that arts can offer, which is not just the delivery of facts, which is what some scientists like to imply?
Well, I wouldn't imply that. I think science is such a beautiful subject in itself. And I think the other interesting thing about the smoke experiments or happenings, it didn't make me look forward, it made me look back. I didn't even have to think about that, and I thought about the film called Metropolis, which is a classic just came to me as I was watching the smoke moving and imaging certain parts that came up.
Yeah, I think that's definitely in line with the kind of atmosphere we were trying to create.
As this project, I'll put it to you representing the student group, but I know they're in the audience as well, has it changed any perceptions you had of engineering or engineers?
You can shout down as well if you want to say anything. For me, there was... Did someone shout? No. Okay. For me, it was very interesting having been in these contexts before with people from different fields who do definitely have this idea of arts is to illustrate, it's to make colourful the facts that we present. And that's not true of everyone, again, not to generalise, but I've had that experience a few times, which I find quite frustrating because I think arts comes with its own philosophy, its own language, its own facts in a way. What I did really enjoy about this project was the approach from all of the engineers that we spoke to, whether it was from people working in the university or to friends, about this more flexible understanding of reality and future. There was never a point where anyone gave us information and said, this is what it's about, or this is what it's about. It was much more loose, much more fluid. I very much appreciated that, yeah.
What about the engineers? How did you feel watching the performances tonight? Did you feel represented or inspired or scared?
I thought the first part of the performance, it really kind of caught the playful nature of a lot of engineering, and it is that kind of tinkering, and whether tinkering's in the lab or building, nanoscale electronics, or just tinkering, intellectually with different ideas, and it's that kind of playfulness which I thought kind of come across. It's very, very satisfying again in the kind of first part of the performance of trying different things. Some things don't work, and it's about again exploring the envelope of the possible and how we can use our understanding of physics to put things together in different ways. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, and that's all part of that. Again, I think inherently creative process.
Yeah, I also felt it's about just trying to improve things. But what struck me the most was the fume. I saw the fume as a danger, because they're basically, you can divide more or less people in two parts. One of them are I don't want anything to change. I like how it is. I know what to do, where to go. I know everything. I don't want to change. And then there's the other side of the people let's go and see. Let's see what's happened. And that fume was kind of that unknown nature that you can't see through. You don't know what's going to happen. That was the part that I enjoyed the most.
I quite like the idea of failing, and the fact that the very first few performances were about trying something and then something doesn't work and then thinking about it a little bit, and then someone comes with a solution and plugs it in, and so it worked very well. And then you build this big structure, and instead of saying, well, this is it, you just tear it down and try again with something else. And I think this is something that resonated with me quite a lot.
That's good.
Yeah. I want to come back on this point about the role of technology and changing how we might view or think of the world. And I want to make an analogy. So it's been claimed that one of the most transformational things that happened in human development was the discovery of an external stomach, which is actually known as cooking. So cooking transformed the human brain by permitting the intake of calories 50 or 100 years. This is the thousands of years time frame. I don't know where this is going.
We don't know either.
I think it's a pretty good summary of human history. We don't know.
But I think this is key, the fact that we don't know, and the fact that we're here to discuss this and move together. Colin was saying this is really co-development, and it is about us as engineers saying we could do this. Is that something that you think is interesting? And we do that a lot nowadays. We do talk outside of our fields, outside of our community, about what it means to do what we are doing. So, for example, I develop lots of medical diagnostic devices, finger prick tests like pregnancy tests, but to see lots of other diseases, and in particular, it can be used also for non-diseases. So we were talking about genomics. So what do I do with the information that I get out of these tests? What do you do with it? Right? It's a very difficult question, and it's not a question that, as Colin was pointing out, is for engineers to solve. It's a question for society to solve, and I think this is something we have to do together.
I think that's a nice message to
Wow.
end on. Can you join me in thanking our panelists, Christiana, Colin, Maira, and Julien?